Yo, what's up guys? Alpha, and today I'm going to be doing a set review for Alchemy Phyrexia Will Be One that's going to be dropping on Arena later today. So in the set review I'm going to be talking about all the cards for both Historic and Alchemy, what I think of them, you know, what homes they could potentially fit into, whether they could potentially birth new archetypes. And now I've been away for a week, so I've only seen the spoiler for this morning, so this video is definitely going to be more of a gut reaction to the cards than anything else, but I'm really excited to get my hands on them and see how they perform. But anyway, let's just go straight into it, starting off here with Ghalma the Shaper. So this is a really interesting card, and the ceiling on this card is pretty high, right? Because if you can attack with this multiple times and get multiple Tempered Steels into your hand or multiple 1/1s, that's really, really powerful. Now, in terms of Historic, I think the big issue with this card is that the trigger is on attack rather than enter the battlefield. If the trigger was on enter the battlefield, then I'd be really high on this card, because a 3/3, you know, a 3-mana 3/3 Vigilance obviously isn't that great, but the fact you get a Tempered Steel in your hand, which if your deck is built around Tempered Steel, which it would kind of have to be for you to want to run this card, Tempered Steel is one of the best cards in the deck, so this would essentially allow you to run 8 copies of Tempered Steel. It's also a creature that allows you to run an enchantment in your deck, essentially. So if you're running a deck with like 4 Collected Company, 4 Kaila's Reconstruction, you could run this as a creature that gives you access to Tempered Steel without affecting your creature count. So there are some really nice things you could do with this in Historic, but it being an attack rather than ETB makes it so much worse because it's really vulnerable to way more types of interaction. Now, we've seen with Crucius that you don't need to have an ETB for it to be good, but the big difference between Crucius and this is Crucius triggers on the end step, which means not only is it not vulnerable to sorcery speed removal like Molten Impact, but it also means that it doesn't punish the opponent for tapping out, right? Because if you're on the play and the opponent taps out on turn 2, you can just safely go Crucius and know you're going to get a trigger, whereas if you're on the play and the opponent taps out on turn 2 and you go Ghalma, the opponent can just very easily untap and just kill it before you get to attack. The other obvious really big issue with having to attack is that if the opponent has good blocks, this is really awkward, because say the opponent has a 4/4 in play, you just can't really attack with this and get the trigger. So like I said, if this was ETB, I think it would definitely be Historic playable. Because it's not, I don't think it is, unfortunately. Now, in terms of Alchemy, you know, a lot of the same issues still apply there. There is a decent amount of removal in the format that's targeted to kill Crucius before it activates, so that would also hit Ghalma, which is a bit of an issue, but considering the power level of Alchemy is a lot lower than Historic, I definitely think this has much more potential to see play. Now, the other big issue with this card in Alchemy is that there isn't really an artifact-based aggro deck, and you would have to be running an artifact-based aggro deck for this to be good, I think. And there's already Brotherhood's End in the format that's being run to target the Anvil decks, and just the other go-wide aggro decks. So I think this is a very powerful card in Alchemy, but because people are running stuff to kill Crucius, because people are already running Brotherhood's End, I'm not really sure this is going to see play, because it doesn't have a home, and the home it would need is already the metagame is already hostile towards an artifact-based aggro deck, if that makes sense. So super cool card. Kind of wish it was on ETB so it'd be Historic playable. As things stand, you know, it could see play in Alchemy, but I just don't think there's a good home for it right now, if that makes sense. So next up, we've got Kemba's Outfitter. So I think this is definitely one that's more aimed at Historic rather than Alchemy, because this is obviously perfect for the Colossus Hammer Time deck. So I've tried Hammer Time in both Explorer and Historic. The big issue compared to the Pioneer versions is we don't have Sigarda's Aid, so there's just not enough redundancy for getting the hammer on. This acting as extra redundancy is great. So now we don't have to worry about not having Sigarda's Aid. And I have seen some hammer lists in Pioneer that are just all focused on cat synergies because of the 2-mana Kemba that we just got in the main set. So I definitely think there could be this is definitely going to improve hammer time in Historic, because it gives the deck extra redundancy. You know, I've tried it, and the 2 main issues I've had with that deck is lack of redundancy getting hammer on, and lack of a good plan B when you can't get the hammer to work. And this definitely helps to address one of those issues. So it will improve the deck in Historic, but I'm not really sure the deck is going to be good enough to compete at the top level. If we get Sigarda's Aid in the next remastered set, I think we are actually. I think they confirmed it. But once we do have Sigarda's Aid, then I think the deck might have enough redundancy where you can go a bit more all in on the hammer, potentially. But as things stand, you know, I think it's a big boost for that deck, but I'm not sure that's going to be enough, personally. We'll have to see. In terms of Alchemy, obviously Colossus Hammer isn't legal. Now, there is an alternative to Colossus Hammer that's legal in Alchemy. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but it's a similar, you know, effect where it has a very high equip cost. But the issue is, I don't really think that's worth building around, to be honest. You know, you'd have to, you don't have that many good ways to tutor it. I think the equipment is also off color as well. So in Alchemy, you know, as a 1-mana 2/1 that's decent stats, you could run it alongside the new sword, for example. But same issue as the last card. I don't really think there's a good home for it in Alchemy, and I don't think it's worth building around. I don't think the home that it would fit into is good enough in and of itself. So I definitely think this is one that's more for Historic than Alchemy. I'm going to be trying it out on both formats though. We'll have to see how it performs. And next we've got Nettling Host. So this is one of the first toxic, boosts to the toxic archetype that we see in this set. Now, in Historic, I'm not very high on Toxic. I think if Toxic is going to be viable, it will probably be a Venerated Rot Priest deck. But that will be kind of more of a combo deck than a value deck. And this definitely seems like more of a card that would fit into a value Toxic deck. So I don't think this is going to see play in Historic because of that. But in terms of Alchemy, I have played against the Toxic deck a few times. I haven't got around to playing it myself yet. But my initial impressions seem that it's fine, but not great. And the big issue with the Toxic deck in Alchemy is just that there aren't enough cards for you to be able to customize and innovate on the deck. So the fact that we're getting additional support in this set for it makes me more optimistic that a viable Toxic deck in Alchemy could be good. Now, the really nice thing about this card is it synergizes super well with all the Might tokens, stuff that you get off like Scrolls Hive or other Toxic cards that produce the Might tokens as well. So if you have a bunch of Might tokens in play and you get the Nettle Cyst off this, it's going to be a huge body straight away. A lot of the Toxic creatures have evasion, whether that's flying or whatever. And so being able to then equip the Nettle Cyst to your flyer to just potentially attack and deal lethal through regular damage is pretty sick. The kind of awkward thing about this card though is that with Toxic, you're trying to win through Toxic damage for the most part. And Nettle Cyst kind of goes against that, right? That helps you win with regular damage, but it's still a really powerful card, right? Toxic 2 is decent, and being able to turn it into a Nettle Cyst later in the game is pretty nice. So if there is a Toxic deck in Alchemy, I wouldn't be surprised if this is a part of it, because it does seem pretty powerful if you can consistently get the 3 poison counters on the opponent. Speaking of Toxic support, this is another card that they get, Norn's Fetchling. So this is basically an ambitious farmhand in the early game, and then once you have those 3 poison counters on, you can just start seeking non-land cards instead, which is pretty nice. Ambitious farmhand has seen play in both Standard and Alchemy, so I definitely wouldn't be surprised for this to see play in Toxic decks. The fact that it enables you to consistently find your lands more often is really nice, and then not going to be a dead draw later in the game if you can consistently get those first 3 poison counters on as well. So I definitely think this is going to be a really nice card for the Toxic deck. So I'm really excited to try it out in Alchemy and see if we can get this to break through. And I think this is a potentially powerful part of the deck just for consistency more than anything else. And next up we've got Quicksilver Servitor. So this is an interesting card. It does have a powerful ability. I think the main way you would want to look to kind of abuse this is to have obviously have a card that you want to proliferate with, whether that's a Planeswalker or a permanent that wants to be building up counters on it. And then if you're able to run that alongside a bunch of cantrips, that could be pretty good because, you could draw for your turn, then cantrip to draw another card, and then if you draw another cantrip, you can cast that and proliferate again. In terms of Historic, I just think that that's just too slow and mopey. If there was a deck that already wanted to be proliferating that had a bunch of cantrips in, then I think this could be good, but this just seems like the sort of card where you would really have to build around it, and the payoff just doesn't seem that good. In Alchemy, same sort of thing applies there, but because the power level is slower, you can afford to go a bit more in-depth in stuff that takes a little bit longer to set up. Now, I'm not sure what the best target to proliferate would be. My first instinct is you could potentially run a Planeswalker heavy deck with this, and then a bunch of, cheap instants or sorceries, a lot of cantrips basically, and, interactions so that you can chain together a bunch of cantrips and cast what you draw and then proliferate off that. But again, there isn't a good home for it, and unless there's a combo I'm missing out on, I'm not really sure this is going to see play in either format, unfortunately. And next up we've got Surgical Metamorph. So this is basically, Phyrexian Metamorph, but it only costs 3 mana if you're on the draw. Now, first of all, before I get into the actual card itself, I absolutely love these designs where the card changes whether you're on the play or draw, and I really hope they keep printing these because, play or draw disparity is something that is always been a big problem for competitive Magic, and so if they continue to print cards like this that are playable, then I'll be super happy because, they do stuff like Forsaken Crossroads particularly as a card I really like because it does help to kind of mitigate the play draw disparity a little bit. So in terms of this card, in Historic, this is basically just worst copy of Phyrexian Metamorph, which always costs 3 as long as you have the 2 life to pay for the Phyrexian mana, and that card basically doesn't see play anywhere. So the only deck I could even see this having a chance in Historic is Gyruda, potentially. If Gyruda becomes popular, then you might want this as copies, 5 through 8 of Phyrexian Metamorph, but outside of that, I don't think it's going to see play in Historic. In terms of Alchemy, though, I'm not sure. I mean, it's definitely power level wise good enough to see play in Alchemy, but I just don't think there's a good home for it, really. You'd want to be running it in a deck that wants clone effects, and with the Niambi combo being rebalanced, I don't think that was the main deck that would be interested in it. So I can't think of any other deck unless I'm missing a combo somewhere that would want a clone effect. It's also an artifact, which can be nice in artifact synergy decks, and obviously on the draw, being able to go 3 mana, copy anything that the opponent has or that you have is pretty good. But again, I just don't think it has a good home. So I honestly wouldn't be surprised if this card just doesn't see play in either format. And next up, we've got Tezzeret's Reckoning. So this is an interesting one. I guess the closest comparison for Alchemy legal stuff right now is Impulse. So the difference here is that you get to change your mind, basically. So if you exile the 3 cards and you go, okay, I would rather have the land, and then you wait a turn and you happen to draw a land off the top, you can then go, okay, now I've got a land, I can go for one of the other cards instead. Now, having said that, I'm not really sure that's going to be good enough, because most of the cards that want to be most of the decks that want to be running Impulse really value looking a card deeper, right? Impulse sees 4, this only sees 3, so I think all the decks that would want to run this sort of effect would prefer to run Impulse instead. Impulse is already legal in Alchemy as well, so I think this is probably only going to see play if you wanted to run copies 5 through 8 of Impulse. In terms of Historic, Impulse is basically never played there anyway, and I think Impulse is a better card, so very much doubt this is going to see play in Historic. Like I said, in Alchemy, I only think this is going to see play if you're running a deck that really wants to be digging through as much as possible. And, if you wanted to run additional copies of Impulse, because I don't think the ability to change the card you pick is better than looking an extra card deep in decks that want to be digging for stuff, if that makes sense. And next up, we've got Blightwing Whelp. So this is another Toxic support card. And this seems, again, I don't think Toxic is going to be good in Historic, so I'm not really concerned about this card for Historic at all. In terms of Alchemy, though, this does seem like a pretty reasonable card for the Toxic archetype. Not that many decks are running flyers, so you can start connecting with this fairly easily, I think. And, be able to not only deal poison counters, but also start seeking cards. Does mean that this will run away with the game if the opponent isn't able to kill it, which is pretty powerful. 3 mana card that is essentially a must-kill threat is going to be good. Now, having said that, there are some decks that run flyers, and this being black is a little bit awkward, considering white-green is the main 2 colours you want to be running for Toxic, I think. Now, we have obviously recently got the new the fast lands, and so I could potentially see a 3-colour deck being viable, but Toxic seems like it wants to be low to the ground and be curving out, which is where 3-colour decks tend to fall apart when you don't have great mana bases. So I don't know. I think you could potentially run white, green, splashing black if you did want to run this, and this does seem like a pretty good payoff for Toxic, so I wouldn't be surprised if this saw play in Alchemy, but it being in black could be a little bit awkward in terms of your mana base. Next up, we've got March Towards Perfection. So this is kind of a weird card. So the spellbook is basically just a bunch of Phyrexian creatures. So you play this for 1 mana, you get the boon, and then you get the creature off the spellbook. And then if you don't have any other Phyrexians, you obviously get the boon when you play the Phyrexian from your hand. Now, this card's kind of weird because, I don't think it's worth running Phyrexian Tribal in either format. There just aren't enough payoffs for it. So if you're running this as a card where you get the boon, then you get the bonus off it on turn 2 by playing a Phyrexian on turn 2, I just don't think there's good enough cheap Phyrexians for that to be worth it in either format. And then the only other real use I can think of this for is, if you're running stuff like Arcanist or Jarsteel, because you can play this, get a creature in your hand, and then cast it again from the graveyard with an Arcanist or Jarsteel, which seems fine. But outside of that, I don't really think there's much, there's no point in running this over just another creature, right? Because if you don't have Phyrexian Tribal synergies, you just play this on turn 1 and get a random creature into your hand, which is just worse than just putting a good creature in your deck, if that makes sense. So, maybe this is okay in Arcanist decks, but overall, I don't really think there's a good home for this card, unfortunately. And next I've got Sheoldred's Assimilator. So this is a really interesting card. I think this does have potential because it's kind of similar to Graveyard Trespasser, but a mana cheaper, which is huge because, Graveyard Trespasser is a card that sees play in Historic. and Alchemy as well. And so, you know, having a similar effect on a 2-mana card that also has a reasonable body does seem decent. So if this card didn't have Menace, I'd be a lot lower on it, because, you know, you do need to attack to get that repeatable graveyard hate going. But, you know, the fact it has Menace means it's kind of skirts around that a little bit. Now, one of the big advantages of Graveyard Trespasser is the ward. You don't really have protection from removal on this, but the fact it's a mana cheaper kind of mitigates that a little bit. So, I don't know, I feel like there's definitely potential for this to see play in Historic. I'm not sure you would main deck this, but if you're running a deck where you want a high threat density and also some more incidental graveyard hate, I think this is a pretty good option, because it is very aggressively slanted, even against decks that do run some creatures. The Menace means that they have to get multiple creatures into play before they can start getting in the way of this. It can also trade up with a lot of 3-mana creatures, because 3 toughness is pretty common in Historic right now. And now, obviously, the big weakness of cards like this in Graveyard Trespasser is the graveyard hate is at sorcery speed, which doesn't help against stuff like the opponent pitching and interacting with the graveyard in the same turn. But, you know, if you're running a deck that wants to run aggressive creatures and have graveyard hate, I definitely could see this play in Historic. And then I definitely think this could see play in Alchemy as well. You know, there are a lot of decks that are interacting with the graveyard right now. You know, you've got Vat of Rebirth decks, you've got Ascend from Avernus decks, you've got decks that are trying to loop Time Walk from the graveyard with Oracle of the Alpha, you've got Gender Reanimator decks. So I think this could be a perfectly main deckable card if you're running a black base mid-range deck, which, you know, there are a number of black base mid-range decks that are viable in the format right now, you know, whether that's Anvil or Grixis or Jund. So I definitely think that this is a card that could see play in both Alchemy and Historic, probably more in sideboards than Historic, but it's definitely an interesting card, and I'm going to be trying it out nonetheless. Next we've got Hexgold Sledge. So this is an equipment that conjures a Goblin Cavalier, which is this card if you're not familiar with it. And I don't know, this card just doesn't seem that great for 3 mana. When I first read it, I thought that it would automatically equip the Sledge to the Cavalier, but it doesn't do that, unfortunately. You just get the equipment and the Cavalier. So for 2 mana, you're getting an equipment that gives +1/+0 and equip 1, which just doesn't seem that great. So I don't know, definitely not good enough for Historic, and probably not good enough for Alchemy, because there just isn't enough equip synergies there either. So yeah, I'm not really sure. Maybe I'm missing something, but I don't really see this one seeing play in either format, unfortunately. Next up, we've got Magmatic Scorchwing. So this is kind of reminiscent of Glorybringer. Now, in Historic, I think Glorybringer is almost entirely better, right? You know, you don't have to run all basic lands in your deck, which is a big drawback in Historic, right? Even mono red decks that don't want to be running colorless lands still want to run Den of the Bugbear and Ramunet Ruins and stuff like that. So, you know, Glorybringer is just better. You know, the fact it has haste, the fact it can deal 4 damage, the fact it can, you know, repeatedly damage stuff is just a lot better. Obviously, Glorybringer isn't legal in Alchemy, but I don't know, you know, having to, again, if you're running mono red there, being able to run stuff like, is it Mistress Foundry? The colorless creature land, it just doesn't seem worth giving up the utility lands for this card. And I think almost all of the mono red decks don't want to be playing 5 mana cards anyway, right? The regular mono red deck only goes up to Thundering Raiju. The Goblins deck wouldn't really be interested in this either. So I think it's a cool card, but I just don't think it's worth giving up utility lands in order to run this, unfortunately. Next up, we've got Phyrexian Harvester. So this is an interesting one. So this is obviously the next card in the cycle, like kind of the Phyrexian Obliterator sort of thing. And this card is potentially interesting to me. You know, I think the main issue with this card is whether mono red decks want to be running 4-drops. So in Historic, we've obviously got regular mono red aggro with like Embercleave, and that deck does run Torbran. Now, as a replacement, I don't really think that mono red aggro deck would want to be running this over Torbran, because that deck is all about just getting as much power into play as possible, as quickly as possible. And Torbran coming down on turn 4 does that a lot better and closes games out a lot quicker than something like Phyrexian Harvester would. So I think if this was to see play in Historic, it'd be much more. I think you'd be much more interested in like a mono red mid range style of deck. You know, maybe you're running some of the Chandra Planeswalkers. Maybe you're running even mono red Devotion. Right, this having 4 pips of Devotion seems really sick. If you've got a Nykthos deck with a lot of mana sinks as well, so I could see this seeing play in mid-range decks. Now, it being killed by Fatal Push is an issue, but this is going to be really difficult for a lot of decks to deal with, particularly if they rely on red damage-based removal. Now, having said that, a lot of the decks that do rely on red damage-based removal also have flyers, stuff like Is It Phoenix and Is It Wizards, so I'm not sure this on the ground would do you that good in those sorts of matchups, but, if you are wanting to run a mono-red mid-range Chandra-style deck, I could see it seeing play there, but outside of that, not too hot on this in Historic. In Alchemy, again, this does die to go for the throat, but if you're running mono red, again, same sort of issue as the previous card, that you would probably have to give up your Mistress Foundries to run this, so you could potentially run both of these in the same deck in Alchemy, right? You could run the Harvester and the Scorchwing and just all mountains. You could then also potentially run Koth as well, although that's a lot of expensive cards, so I'm not really sure what the rest of the deck would look like, but I don't know, I think this has more of a chance to see played than the Scorchwing. And I don't know, I feel like mono red decks could want this as the top of their curve, right? If the opponent doesn't have Go for the Throat, this card does really run away with the game pretty quickly. So I definitely could see this team play it in Alchemy, but again, you've got the trade-off of running utility lands versus consistently being able to cast this on curve. So we'll have to see on this one. And next up, we've got Rothga Bonded Engulfer. And this card, I don't know, in terms of Historic, it is, it's reasonable on rate, right? 4 mana, 4/4 trample is fine. It's not good stats alone, but then the boon you get is pretty significant. Now, if the boon gave trample as well, I'd be a lot more interested in this. I think, again, this is just a card where it doesn't have a good home in Historic. Mono Green Stompy is a deck in Historic, but it's not really a good one, I don't think. So I'd be surprised if this saw play in Historic. In terms of Explorer, there are a number of ways to build just mono green aggro, big stuff. Give everything trample, just play a bunch of big creatures. And this does seem like a very good card on rate for those sorts of decks. So, if this does see play, I think it's most likely to see play in Alchemy, mono green aggro decks. Okay, so next up we've got Phyresis Roach. So this is another toxic support piece. Again, like I said, I don't think toxic is likely to see play in Historic. In Alchemy, this is an interesting option. It gives everything an additional Toxic 1. When I first read this, I was kind of confused because I forgot that Toxic 1 stacks. So I think the way this works is you get in with it, and then it gives all of your other insects an additional Toxic 1. So all of your other Phyresis Roaches would have Toxic 1, Toxic 1. So it would deal 2 toxic damage whenever it attacks, which is pretty interesting. Now, I think whether this sees play in Alchemy will come down almost entirely to how many 1-drops they want to be running in the deck. And also how many insects they happen to be running, because if you're running, stuff like, the new black cards, like the Blightwing Whelp isn't an insect, and the Fetchling is, but the Nettling Host isn't. So if the vast majority of the creatures in the deck are insects, I think this gets a lot better. And like I said, I think whether this is played will just come down to how many 1-drops the Toxic deck wants to be running, really. But outside of that, obviously not going to see play in Historic, like I said. Next up, we've got Spawning Pod. So this is one of my favourite cards from the set. I'm really excited to try this one. So this is essentially Birthing Pod, but first of all, you have to pay a mana rather than Phyrexian mana, and you don't get to choose its Seeks. So it's at random, basically, but this card seems super interesting to me. I don't think there's a way to just go infinite straight away with a combo. It does work with stuff like Corridor Monitor, so you can go like, sack a 1-drop, get Corridor Monitor, untap it, sack the Corridor Monitor, get Extraction Specialist, get back the Corridor Monitor, and do loops like that. But the fact that this costs 1 mana each go stops you doing that as an infinite chain, if that makes sense. So because of that, you could build a go up the chain Spawning Pod deck, but the issue with that is that the deck just isn't great when you don't have the Spawning Pod. Now, you could also run it alongside Prime Speaker Vannifar, because that does a similar thing, but I've tried Vannifar and it's just felt too clunky. So that is something I'm going to be trying with the Spawning Pod, but I'm not sure that's the best way to abuse it. I think the best way that I can see to use this is either to run a deck where you run a bunch of 4-ofs that are the only creature on that slot on the curve, so you're guaranteed to hit that, right? So you run 4-of, 1 4-of as a 1-drop, 1 4 as a 2-drop, 1 4 as a 3-drop, and that way you could use this as in a combo deck to chew to force certain pieces, right? That could be a potential way that you could use it. Or, I could just see this as being a value card in a Blink deck, for example, where, maybe you're not guaranteed to hit a card, but because everything has ETBs, you're guaranteed to get value off it at least. But I think, if I was to build around this, like I have with a lot of the other Seek cards, I think the best way you want to use this is to have specific cards at each point on the curve that you want to consistently be able to tutor up. And even though this is kind of slow, right, it's 3 mana to get into play and then an extra mana to activate it, it does seem really, really powerful. You know, it's kind of like Pyre of Heroes that cost less to activate and you're not restricted to sticking to a certain type. So I'm definitely excited to try this one out. Again, you know, this seems like a card where you need to test with it a lot with loads of different ideas to get a full understanding of how good it is, but this definitely seems like a really interesting card that could enable something powerful in Historic. Again, you know, in terms of alchemy, I also think this definitely has a decent amount of potential. Same sort of thing, right? You can just build your deck in a way that you can consistently tutor up certain cards with this. And considering alchemy is just generally slower, this also seems pretty nice as well. Now, there is a decent amount of artifact removal in the format right now because of stuff like Midnight Clock and Vat of Rebirth, which could be an issue, but not enough that I don't think is worth running this. And the fact that this allows you to do powerful stuff without interacting with the graveyard does mean that it's harder to hate out as well. So I'm really excited for this card. I think there's a number of different ways that you could build around it. And this is definitely one where I feel like, you know, you could be missing something with it. So if you've got good ideas for how you could use this, definitely let me know in the comments, because this is the first card I'm going to be bringing with when it comes out. And next up, we've got Arek False Goldwarden. So this is an interesting card. You know, it's basically just a 2-mana 2/2 that builds up its activated ability. Now, you know, this being a mythic seems weird to me. Maybe I'm just not visualizing how this card will play out in games, but this just really doesn't seem very good to me. Right, it never grows itself, so it's just a 2-mana 2/2. Obviously, if you're able to, you know, get a bunch of creatures into play repeatedly, then the threat of the activated ability on this is pretty nice, but the fact that it's a tap ability and it costs 5 mana to activate seems pretty absurd to me. Now, maybe, I guess, if you're playing a sacrifice deck, this could be good, right? If you're playing like an Anvil deck, or, you know, I don't know, Cat Oven's not very good in Historic, but if you had that sort of thing going where you're repeatedly putting creatures into play every single turn, and then the intensity multiplies, and you can maybe bring this back from the graveyard repeatedly, you know, you can activate it and deal like 5 or 6 damage, then bring it back with like a Recommission or Tyvar, for example, which allows you to activate it straight away, then I can see that being good, but you know, 5 mana is a lot to activate, and you have to jump through a lot of hoops for this to be better than just a 2-mana 2/2. So, I don't know. Maybe I'm missing something with this card, but it just doesn't seem very powerful to me. But again, you know, I've had this in the past where I've read a mythic and thought it wasn't that great, and then I actually play with it and it is good. But first read, I'm not super impressed with this card, but I'll definitely be happy to be proven wrong on that one. Next, we've got Bladehold Cleaver. So this is another equipment, and when so it comes into play on a body because it has the 4 Mirrodin, and then whenever the equipped creature dies, you draft a card from its spellbook, which is basically all just creatures and a few artifacts. And this just seems way too slow for Historic to me, unfortunately. You know, equipment has to be very good to see play. Now, this does have the bonus that it comes into play on a body, but 4 mana for this sort of effect is just way too slow. In Alchemy, you know, there's more of a chance that this sees play, but there's just not a good home for it, and I don't think we've got enough equipment support recently that it's likely to spawn a whole new deck. So unfortunately, I don't really think this is going to see play in either format. Next up, we've got Contagion Dispenser. So this is kind of an interesting card. You know, you get Proliferate on ETB, and then, you know, you get to draft cards from its spellbook whenever you proliferate during your turn as well. But again, this just seems way too slow. That there's no chance this sees play in Historic, just because there's no deck that would want to use this. And if you did build a deck around it, it would just, you know, you'd be jumping through way too many hoops. And then same sort of deal in Alchemy, I think. You know, even though Alchemy is slower, this just seems really slow. And, you know, there's no, I'm sure there are some combos that you can do with Proliferate, but I think they're just all way too convoluted to set up. So unless there is a Proliferate deck that I'm not aware of, you could run this as kind of like a grindy card, but Proliferate decks generally tend to have really good things that they're doing in the mid to late game anyway, so yeah, I don't know. I just don't see this card seeing play in either format, unfortunately. Next we've got Darksteel Hydra. So this is a potentially powerful card, right? Now the base rate for this is you have to pay it for 4 mana, like 4 mana 2/2 Indestructible. Now Indestructible is the main, you know, bonus on this card. You know, a 4 mana Indestructible creature isn't, you know, that's nothing to sniff at because you don't normally get them that cheap. So at a base rate, getting a 2/2 indestructible can be decent. You know, that's way below the power curve for Historic, which I'm not really sure this is likely to see play, because, you know, Historic just doesn't really have good Abzan decks. So again, same with a lot of the cards in this set. I just don't think it has a good home. And then you do get the Darksteel Ingot and Darksteel Plate in your hand, so you do get quite a lot of value. Even if you play this for just 4 mana, you're getting a lot of value, but I just don't think there's a good home for it in Historic. In terms of Alchemy, I mean, again, there's not really an Abzan deck in Alchemy, but this card does seem powerful enough that it wouldn't surprise me if, you know, some people start trying Abzan to see if they can get this card to work. But again, you know, Black-Red is by far and away the most powerful colour in Alchemy right now, and it just doesn't feel worth moving away from having access to Fable of the Mirror Breaker and Crucius just to get access to the Darksteel Hydra. So, I mean, in terms of power level, this card definitely is good enough to see play in Alchemy, potentially even Historic maybe as well, but I just don't think there's a deck that this fits into at all in either format, unfortunately. Next up, we've got Glistening Extractor. So this is an interesting one, kind of like a value engine that gets you a 1-drop, then a 2-drop, then a 3-drop. I think this is just way too slow for Historic, unfortunately. But in terms of Alchemy, you know, this is an interesting card. You know, the first thing that came to mind when I read this was that it could be interesting in a combo deck, right? Because if your key combo card is a 3-drop, for example, you could just build your deck in a way where that key card is the only 3-drop you'll run, so you're guaranteed to find it off this, but it takes 3 turns to find that, and, you know, compared to other cards that you have access to at 4 mana like Rusko or Tasha, I'm not really sure this is going to be good enough as just a value card. You know, maybe in Grixis mid-range mirror matches, this is good. Like I said, if there's a combo deck where you can guarantee finding one of your combo pieces of this could be good there as well, but outside of that, I think there's just better things that you can be doing with 4 mana in Alchemy already. Next up, we've got Gyox Brutal Carnivora, and this is kind of like an oil counter synergy card, which is kind of a shame because, again, same sort of thing with all the other cards in the deck. Oil synergies haven't really been good enough to break through in Alchemy from what I've seen. You know, maybe a card or two, but definitely not a whole deck built around it. Now, the nice thing about this card is that you don't really need to have a ton of oil counter synergies for this to be good on its own, right? You can start putting counters on stuff, and then as they die, you get duplicates of it in your deck that are bigger, but again, I'm not really sure that's worth it. If you got duplicates into your hand, then I think this card would be pretty sick, but as things stand, you know, it's just too slow for Historic, and even in Alchemy, I just don't really think it's doing enough. You know, if you are playing an oil counter synergy deck, then that's a different story, but again, I just don't think there's a deck that this really fits into cleanly, unfortunately. Unless there's some sick synergy that I'm thinking of with the oil counters, I just don't really think this is going to see much play in the current meta, unfortunately. And next we've got Ichor Aberration. So this is kind of an interesting card. Again, it's another card that synergizes with the Proliferate synergies. And you can cast this from your graveyard, which is pretty nice as well. But again, you know, I just don't think there's a good home for this. It's an interesting card. It's an interesting build around. But just too slow for Historic. And I just don't think, you know, this is definitely a card where you need to be running a lot of proliferation stuff to be able to start casting it from the graveyard. And if you are running a lot of proliferate stuff, then this seems pretty good. You know, maybe if you're running blue-black toxic, where, you know, you're running more of a spell-based deck, where you're running instants that, you know, I can't remember the name of it, but there's an instant that gives the opponent a poison counter, and then you can start proliferating up from there. This seems like a decent way to block if you're running that sort of deck. Like, I know Croaky's posted a mono blue combo list that was doing a similar thing, so this could be good as a blocker in those sorts of decks if you're running like a blue-black control toxic shell. So that could be somewhere that this could see play that I'm probably going to try out, but outside of that, I don't really think this is going to see play in a proliferate deck, unfortunately. So next up, we've got Innovative Metatect. So this is kind of an interesting card. So Artifact Aggro is definitely a viable archetype in Historic. There's a ton of different ways you can build it. You know, you can go the Thopter route. You can go, you know, Ginger Brutes and Machiko's Reign of Truth. So you can go Tempered Steel. And I definitely think that there's a good deck within that shell, right? You could go blue-white Thopters, which is a deck that people have been running for a while. This can be played with Lurrus because it's only a 2-drop, which is pretty nice as well. And so if you focus your deck in having a lot of artifact creatures to play on turn 1, this is potentially an option that I could see being reasonable in Historic. You know, particularly if you're running stuff like Ginger Brute that you can give unblockable. This seems pretty nice with there. So I wouldn't be surprised if this could potentially see play in a Historic blue-white, low-to-the-ground Lurrus aggro deck. And the nice thing about being in blue-white as opposed to red-white is it gives you access to Metallic Rebuke, which then gives you a way to stop Brotherhood's End, which is pretty sick. So, I wouldn't be surprised if this could see play in Historic. It might be a sideboard card again for decks where the opponent doesn't have blockers. And the fact that it isn't an artifact itself is a little bit awkward as well. It's kind of fighting for the same spot as Ingenious Smith. But, if you're running a deck with Ginger Brutes and Ornithopters and ways to buff them, then this card does seem like it could be good there. Not 100% sure because there are a lot of good artifact synergy cards in Historic, but I'm definitely going to be trying it out. And then in Alchemy, obviously with the smaller card pool, this card should be even better because it's lower power level. But again, same issue as before. I'm not sure there's a good artifact aggro deck in Alchemy. Now again, we are getting a couple pieces to support it. So there is a chance that this alongside the first card we looked at, the Ghalma, is good enough. Hold on, let me get back to the Metatect. Yeah. So maybe, those two cards are good enough for an artifact aggro archetype to emerge, but for the most part I'm mainly excited for this in kind of like a blue-white Lurrus historic artifact aggro deck. But yeah, we'll have to see. It definitely is a powerful effect, particularly in the Lurrus deck as well. And next up we've got Mephidross Slime. So this is kind of an interesting card. Definitely not going to be powerful enough for historic. It seems fine in Alchemy, right? 3 mana 3/3 trample isn't that good at all, but the fact that you then get 3 mana 6/6 tramples in your deck is pretty nice. But again, there's just way better things to be doing for 3 mana. I'm not sure this really has a good home in Historic. It's, if you're running Juns, this is never going to beat out Fable, Jostle, or Crucius at the 3-drop slot. So, cool card, like fine power level for Alchemy, but I think there's just way better options, particularly in this color combination. We just got Glisser, which seems a lot better than this. So yeah, I just don't think this is going to be good enough to see play in either format. Next up we've got Quicksilver Lapidary, which is a really cool card. So this conjures a Mox Opal into your hand, which is basically a 0 mana Moxen that doesn't come online unless you have 3 total artifacts in play. So this is a really interesting card. I think, the main place I'm hopeful that this could see play is in Historic. I think in Alchemy, in blue-red, there isn't really like a blue-red low-to-the-ground artifact deck, so there isn't really a good home for it. Now again, we have seen some artifact support cards, so this could maybe see play in a Jeskai deck, but if you're running low-to-the-ground aggro deck, running 3 colours in a format where the mana base isn't great, isn't the best idea, I don't think. In terms of Historic, this is kind of interesting. You could play this in regular affinity, which is, mainly blue-white, but there is definitely bonuses for splashing red for stuff like Yotia Declares War, maybe Voltage Surge, maybe the other Saheeli Planeswalker. But I don't know. I feel like this isn't a good enough reason to be splashing red in the affinity deck, and getting this doesn't seem much better than Ingenious Smith either. I think the big issue with Affinity right now is Brotherhood's End. Obviously Divine Purge is an issue as well, but considering the prominence of Rakdos Midrange right now, I don't think Control is a big enough force where Divine Purge is that much of an issue, but Brotherhood's End definitely is. And compare this to Ingenious Smith. Smith kind of mitigates you against Brotherhood's End because it's a body that keeps growing. So if the opponent chooses to Brotherhood's End, destroying all artifacts, you still get to keep the Ingenious Smith about. Whereas this, you get the Mox Amber, which if you already have artifacts in play, you can use it to accelerate even further, which is pretty nice, but it doesn't help against Brotherhood's End, which is a big issue. So I'm not really sure this is going to make the cut in Affinity, but 2 decks I could see this potentially seeing play in. First of all is Underworld Breach, because Breach is a deck that wants 0 mana artifacts to be able to loop once you have your graveyard set up already, alongside stuff like Dragon's Rage Channeler potentially, or Diligent Excavator maybe. And, you could definitely build versions of that have a lot of early artifacts, because you kind of want to be running Emery in that deck anyway, I think. And so you want to be running a bunch of cheap artifacts. So I could see this in play in Breach potentially. Not 100% sure, because that deck, there's a lot of different ways you can build it, and I'm not sure this is worth a slot there, really. Then other combo decks that want to have 0 mana artifacts. First of all, you've got Song of Creation. Now, again, I'm not sure Song of Creation really wants this that much, but it's definitely a cool... it's a way to ensure that you don't brick as often with the Song of Creation. And then the third deck I was thinking of that could take advantage of this is Displacer Kitten combo, because that was always a deck where you're happy to be running the Teferi. You can be happy to run Displacer Kitten if you run stuff that you can blink with it, but having to run Mox Amber was really awkward in the past. So if you could run this as a way to generate the Moxen so that you don't have to run Mox Amber in your deck, could potentially mean that deck, doesn't have to run Mox Amber and therefore have to run other legendary creatures or planeswalkers when it doesn't really want to be running it, if that makes sense. Now, the issue with that deck is both of the key combo pieces into combo pieces into Teferi and Displacer Kitten are 4 mana. If we had 3 mana Teferi in the format, if it wasn't rebalanced, then I think I'd be much higher on that deck, because you can go Teferi on 3 into Kitten on 4, but having to go 2 4-drops is really clunky and pretty slow, so I'm not 100% sure that's going to make the cut, but this is definitely an interesting card, and I'm definitely going to be trying it out in both Breach and Song of Creation as well. Next up, we've got the Seething Skitter-Priest. So this is another toxic support card. When it enters the battlefield, creatures you control and creatures in your hand perpetually gain. When this creature dies, you get might, basically. So again, this is another toxic support card, but I think toxic, from what I've seen so far, wants to be a low to the ground deck. Probably wants to be mainly in white-green, potentially splashing black, and this just doesn't really seem worth it as a top-end card. 4 mana 3/3 is very bad, obviously. Toxic 1, you obviously want in a toxic deck, and it does give you protection from removal, so maybe if you're in black, you could run this as a sideboard card against sweepers if that's an issue, but outside of that, I think you're just really interested in trying to run cheaper creatures that have toxic and focus on allowing them to connect in combat or protecting them. I think this is just too expensive and too low impact, really. Next up, we've got Skull Piercer Nat. So this is another card that supports the toxic archetype. It having flying is obviously a really big deal, because the big issue with ground creatures with toxic is they can get chump blocked or just blocked in general very easily. And this seems like a pretty punishing effect, right? You start getting in, which gets the toxic on, and then you put the opponent in a position where they're essentially damaging themselves by playing the cards that you hit off the effect on this. So this does seem like a very powerful card. Again, the issue with this is the color pairing. Like I've said, almost all of the toxic decks that I've seen so far are green-white. Again, I think the mana base is probably fine enough with the slow lands right now where you could potentially splash a third color. And I think this is more appealing, splashing blue, than, splashing black for the other flying creature. Just because this is a mana cheaper and, it starts putting much more pressure on the opponent much quicker. So yeah, I could definitely see this being played in Alchemy in the toxic deck, but I think whether it's good or not will just come down to how good the mana base is in that deck, really, because you need to be running 13 blue and 13 green to be able to cast this on turn 2, and if you're also running white, that's going to be pretty difficult to set up consistently, but we'll have to see, if for example, a green-blue Rot Priest deck is viable, then this is definitely a slam dunk in that deck as well, so good card, just the colour pair is a little bit awkward in Alchemy. And next up, we've got Vexir Iktekis Air. I have no idea how to pronounce that one, but this is a 3 mana 3/4, and you basically just create 3/3s every time you seek, which is pretty interesting because there are a number of cards that seek, and this is a pretty sick, repeatable effect to have. Now, again, I think the seek cards, there are enough seek cards in the format that are just good enough on their own, where you don't really have to go too far to build around this. Having said that, I don't think it's going to be good enough for Historic, but in Alchemy, I wouldn't be surprised if this does see play, because, like I said, there are just a number of cards that are good in their own right that happen to seek as part of their effect. And this just producing an army of creatures every time you do that seems pretty sick. Now, I'm not sure what the rest of the deck would look like, really, but if there is just a good value pile with a bunch of seek cards, this does seem like a pretty nice payoff for that. And it having 4 toughness is pretty relevant against stuff like a Braid as well. So even though it is a card that you have to untap with to start getting value, 3 mana is kind of the cutoff for that effect being viable. And I definitely think that this is a powerful enough effect that if you could build a deck where there's enough synergy going on and all of the card quality is reasonably good anyway, then this could potentially see play. But like I said, probably not going to make it in Historic. And finally, we've got Phyrexian Scrapyard. So this is a pretty interesting land, and the thing that stands out to me on this is that it's a discard outlet on a land, which is pretty interesting. I don't think we've seen this before in, on Arena at least anyway. So the first thing that comes to mind with this is if you're running a deck that can afford to run colourless lands that wants discard outlets, this is pretty nice. So, Mono Red Madness, whilst not a deck that's been that popular recently could potentially want this as a way to just enable your Madness payoff slightly more easily. If you're running a deck that wants to set up the graveyard, like, I don't know, Reanimator is normally 3 colours, so I don't know if you'd be able to run it there. But if you're after a deck that just wants a very high density of discard outlets and you can afford to run colourless lands, this seems, potentially powerful. Decks like Forsaken Monument could potentially want to run this, although having said that, this would only really be useful in Forsaken Monument at turning other lands that you draw into Phyrexian scrapyards so that you can then turn it into the Soul of New Phyrexia. This is the creature you get off it, by the way, if you haven't seen it before. So pretty powerful card to get off a land, but the fact you have to sacrifice 3 lands to get it into play makes me think that I don't even know if Forsaken Monument decks would want this, because they generally want a high density of colourless lands in play so that if they do draw like an Ugin or an Ulamog off the top, they can just immediately cast it. So yeah, I don't know, maybe this is only going to see play in decks that want a high amount of discard outlets. Because it's colourless, that kind of restricts you to 2 colours max, really. So yeah, I don't know, this might not see any play in Historic, but I could potentially see it seeing play in decks that want the extra discard outlets. In terms of Alchemy, again, I don't really think you can afford to run this in more than monocoloured decks. I already struggle to fit something like Mycosynth Gardens into Anvil, so I think this is only a card that would likely see play in monocoloured decks. The vast majority of monocoloured decks in the format are aggro, and I don't think you want this in an aggro deck over something like a Mishra's Foundry or a Sanctuary, for example. So the discard outlet is cool. If the discard outlet is relevant, then I could definitely see this seeing play. But outside of that, I'm not really sure it's that great. So that's the set overall. It looks pretty interesting. There's definitely a step down in power level for this one. There's not an obvious Crucius or Cabaretti Revels that seems really pushed. But it's kind of interesting because I think most of it is focused on synergies. Most of it is focused on cards that are going to either have decks built around them or fit into specific archetypes that haven't been that popular, which is kind of cool from a deck building perspective. I've definitely got a lot of ideas that I want to try with these cards, particularly in Alchemy. I don't think there's going to be as many that break through in Historic, but there are a few that I'm excited to test out there as well. So anyway, that's the review. Definitely let me know in the comments if there's any cards that you think there are applications for that I've not mentioned or thought about, particularly with the Spawning Pod card. I think that's the card I'm the most excited to brew with myself. But yeah, definitely let me know in the comments if there's something that I might have missed, or if there's decks that you're excited to build with these cards. And then yeah, hopefully once I get my hands on these cards, I'll have some new decks to bring you running these cards. And yeah, definitely let me know in the comments if I missed anything, and I'll catch you all in the next video. Big up.